Welcome to the deep dive. We're looking today at something truly momentous, the direct U.S. military strike on Iranian territory. I mean, this isn't just another headline, is it? It feels like a really profound shift in geopolitical dynamics. And the
Yeah.
questions coming out of it are just immense. So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and cut through some of the noise. We want to deliver the most vital insights we can pull from a whole stack of expert analysis. We've got material from chief international correspondents, security strategists, world affairs editors, North America correspondents, all from a major news organization. We're going to unpack exactly what happened, why now, and maybe most importantly, what could possibly come next.
Yeah, and what's absolutely crucial to grasp, I think, is that this isn't just, another step up. It's being framed as a major turning point, a turning point in this, 45-year standoff between Iran and the United States. Just think about it for a second. Direct military action by the U.S. on Iranian soil. That's completely unprecedented. Iran's own foreign minister called it a red line crossed. That phrase itself just fundamentally alters the rules of engagement, doesn't it?
It really does. That red line comment, it just tells you the gravity of the situation. So the central question, I guess, for our deep dive is, what are the consequences? Immediate, long term. And what factors are actually going to determine the next course of action? It genuinely feels like we've just stepped onto entirely new terrain, incredibly unpredictable, maybe even perilous. And the speed, too. The speed with which this all unfolded is quite remarkable. Just about 10 days before these U.S. strikes, the policy coming out of Washington seemed to be, well, largely that Israeli actions inside Iran were Israel's business, suggesting the U.S. would kind of keep its distance. That policy seems to have been completely flipped on its head now.
Oh, absolutely. It's a significant strategic pivot. What our sources are indicating is that the U.S. strike came after roughly 9 days of Israeli attacks on Iran. And the prevailing belief in Washington was apparently that Iran had been stonewalling negotiations, just digging their heels in. We saw signs of this reportedly during discussions in Geneva. Apparently, the Iranian foreign minister wasn't even close to considering a return to talks until the prior bombing stopped. That's the reporting anyway.
Right. And something we found in these sources that really jumped out was this key U.S. calculation, the thinking guiding this decision. President Trump and his National Security Council, they viewed this moment as Iran's weakest moment. That's the phrase used. Their intelligence reportedly suggested Iran's regional militias were, well, decimated, or at least severely degraded, and their missile stocks depleted. That's a pretty stark assessment.
It is stark. Now, when the U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hex, briefed the public, there was a lot of what the analysis called flamboyant praises for President Trump's decisiveness, quite performative. But General Dan Kane from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he offered a much more, let's say, nuanced approach. He focused on severely degrading Iran's capabilities rather than outright destroying them. And that distinction feels quite important.
It does, and it raises a really vital question. How do you even begin to accurately assess the damage from these strikes, especially when you're talking about underground targets? Our sources really highlight how incredibly difficult it is to know what was in there before they were struck, which makes it incredibly hard then to ascertain Iran's future program capabilities, doesn't it? Particularly when you factor in that IAEA report, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the report on 60% uranium enrichment, which is, well, significantly beyond peaceful use and gets them uncomfortably close to weapons-grade material.
Exactly. Which brings us to this critical concept that kept surfacing in the briefings: force protection.
Ah, yes, force protection. What exactly does that entail for the, 40,000 to 50,000 U.S. forces spread across the Middle East?
Right. So force protection, it's essentially the package deal. All the measures put in place to shield those troops from any potential Iranian response. This includes some pretty sophisticated defensive systems. You got TAID, that's terminal high altitude area defense. These are interceptor missiles. They can reach really high altitudes, giving you that crucial upper layer of defense. Then these are backed up by Patriot missiles for lower altitude threats. And then even closer to the bases, you have things like phalanx, close-in weapon systems. They're designed to target things like unguided rockets or mortars, basically layers of defense. And these layers are absolutely essential for protecting areas of interest that might be on Iran's target list.
Okay, but despite these layers, our sources did flag a specific vulnerability: Royal Air Force Akrotiri, down on the southern tip of Cyprus. Now, even though it's a key strategic asset, they operate those U-2 strategic intelligence aircraft, right? The eyes and ears over the Middle East. It apparently lacks comprehensive force protection. It's not under Israel's Iron Dome or David's Sling or the Arrow 23 interceptors, and currently it doesn't have Patriots or THAAD either. How significant is that risk? What does that gap tell us?
That's a potentially very significant risk, yes. It highlights a possible soft spot, which naturally leads us to think about Iran's retaliatory options.
Right.
What could they actually do? Well, they could certainly engage in asymmetric warfare. We've seen that before, targeting softer, maybe less protected bases in the region, kind of like their response after the Soleimani killing, remember? Or they might opt for more conventional attacks, perhaps using their Fatans-2 hypersonic missiles. Now, these are particularly worrying because they're hypersonic glide vehicles. They make them maneuver unpredictably at just extreme speeds, much harder to intercept once that warhead separates.
Hmm. Now, we have heard some American voices describing Iran as, well, maybe a paper tiger in all this. They point to examples like U.S. bombers reportedly facing no resistance whatsoever during their missions, or Israeli planes apparently flying at will right across Iran. It suggests, maybe they don't have the abilities people assumed. How do our sources square that paper tiger idea with Iran's, well, its documented history as a pretty significant regional power?
Yeah, that's a really crucial distinction to make. Well, Iran certainly has conventional military limitations. I mean, especially when you compare them to U.S. or Israeli air power, that's clear. But its historical reliance on asymmetric warfare ever since the 1979 revolution, and its really sophisticated use of regional proxies, what some analysts call its tentacles across the region. That remains a potent capability, a very real one. They might not want to or be able to engage in a direct, large-scale conventional fight, but they definitely have other ways to respond. Through groups like the Houthis in Yemen, or maybe the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, you know the players. So the core insight here, I think, is that while the U.S. might have acted from a position of perceived strength against Iran's conventional forces, Iran's real enduring threat lies in those deeply ingrained asymmetric capabilities.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, a sensitive but really crucial question that comes up is about casualties. Our sources noted how difficult it is to confirm numbers even before the U.S. directly intervened. There were reports, weren't there, of over 500 killed in those earlier Israeli operations. But Iran hasn't really been providing full information, and there's also the question of whether scientists, people working at those targeted sites, were they moved beforehand? What are the implications of this information vacuum? How does it affect understanding the real impact and Iran's capacity going forward?
Yeah, the information vacuum makes any real assessment incredibly difficult. It just fuels speculation, doesn't it? But what is clear from our sources is that, well, the depth of the U.S.-Israel alliance.
Yeah.
This thing goes back decades. It clearly crosses political lines in both countries. And Donald Trump, in particular, played a really significant role in repairing that relationship, as the analysis puts it, especially after it showed some strain during the Biden administration. Think about moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords. Those were big signals. What's important to understand, though, is that the U.S. supporting Israel's assessment of the Iranian threat, that can, and sometimes has, stood in contrast to assessments from some other Western intelligence agencies. So it reveals a kind of divergence, even among allies, in how this threat is perceived.
Interesting. Okay, let's broaden the lens a bit now to the international reactions. We've seen both Russia and China condemn the U.S. attack, but their motivations, their actual stances, seem quite distinct, don't they?
Very distinct. Russia's stance is particularly nuanced, let's say. Our sources describe them as the dog that didn't bark, which is a great phrase, especially when you consider their dependence on Iranian drones for the war in Ukraine. You'd expect a stronger reaction, perhaps. But despite this, when Putin discussed the situation, the reports say he advised Iran to keep talking to President Trump. Rather than issuing, outright fiery condemnation, this suggests a pretty strong desire for negotiations to continue, maybe to maintain a pragmatic relationship with Trump. It really underscores Russia's own strategic calculations in the region. It's not just about Iran.
Right. And China. Their motivation seems pretty straightforward based on the analysis. Their absolute constant concern is to maintain the stability of the Chinese Communist Party. That seems to be the driving force. So how does that core concern translate into their reaction, which seems, frankly, quite distant from potential military upheavals in the Middle East?
Well, it means they will always prioritize their own internal stability over getting tangled up externally in ways that could disrupt their economic and political balance. So they distance themselves, as the analysis puts it, from potential military upheavals or conflicts like this one, because they see getting directly involved as a threat to their own core interest. Full stop. They'll issue condemnation, sure, but they're highly unlikely to engage in any kind of substantive intervention that could destabilize their own strategic goals. Which brings us actually to a really important point about Iran's internal state. It's clearly weakened economically by decades of sanctions. That's undeniable. And while we've seen protests over power shortages, water, the clerical rule itself, they've caused cracks in the regime, sure, but they haven't actually toppled it. The population now, according to reports coming out, is both terrified and very angry about these recent attacks, understandably, though they also seem to remain quite defiant. It's complex.
And on that question of regime change, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hex was very clear, wasn't he? The operation was not about regime change. That was the line. Despite, maybe some mixed messaging from the U.S. at other times, the official stance was strictly focused on the nuclear facilities. And yet, it's hard to ignore that the Israeli attacks over the preceding 10 days reportedly wiped out most of the upper echelons of the security establishment in Iran. How do we reconcile that stated U.S. policy, no regime change, with the actual impact of these combined strikes on Iran's leadership structure?
It really highlights a very complex situation, doesn't it? Where stated objectives might, well, diverge pretty significantly from the real-world impacts. What's also fascinating here, looking internally, is the fractured nature of the Iranian opposition. There's just no obvious natural kind of alternative to the current regime that could easily step in if it were to collapse. You have Reza Pahlavi, of course, the son of the former Shah. He's an active figure in exile, but he's also seen as being quite close to Benjamin Netanyahu. And that closeness, fairly or unfairly, leads many Iranians inside the country to perceive him as potentially a puppet of the aggressor. Which significantly hinders his ability, you'd have to assume, to unite the incredibly diverse ethnic groups within Iran. Persians, Arabs, Zaris, and others.
And that immediately brings up the very serious risk of a power vacuum, doesn't it? We're hearing analogies being drawn to the chaos of the post-Soviet Union era in the 1990s. Economic anarchy, competing warlords. With Iran's diverse ethnic makeup, how real is that concern? That a collapse of the regime could lead to potentially years of instability in an already incredibly volatile region. What are the sort of practical implications of that kind of scenario for global security?
Oh, it's a very real concern. The historical precedents are frankly sobering. The practical implication would be massive regional disruption, potentially global disruption, especially given Iran's strategic location, its size, its oil reserves. It's huge, which actually leads us back to an important question. Why is Iran targeted specifically for its nuclear program, especially given that it is a member of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's not currently a nuclear state? The core reason, according to the analysis, is its foreign policy stance, its rhetoric. From the very first day of the 1979 revolution, Iran has consistently called for the destruction of Israel. That's been a cornerstone policy. We've even seen messages like, Israel should be destroyed, appearing on their ballistic missiles during parades. So when a country threatens another nation with actual destruction and simultaneously acquires the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, well, that ambition immediately becomes a clear and present threat, regardless of NPT membership. That's the argument.
Right. And speaking of responses, Iran does have some other potential options, doesn't it? Beyond direct military retaliation, there's the maybe symbolic gesture of the Iranian parliament voting to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is where, 20% of the global oil supply passes through. That's huge. And then there's the kind of worst case scenario that people are contemplating, Iran attempting to actually destroy oil infrastructure in the region, particularly in countries where the U.S. has military bases. What's the significance of these non-military options? How seriously are they being considered?
Both are extremely serious considerations, though one is perhaps more symbolic, the other potentially catastrophic. Closing the Strait of Hormuz, even symbolically or temporarily, would almost certainly send global oil prices skyrocketing. Immense economic disruption. But destroying regional oil infrastructure, that would be an act of economic warfare with truly global repercussions far beyond the immediate military conflict itself. And just to add, on the international stage, it's worth noting the UN Security Council is currently meeting to discuss these U.S. strikes, which really underscores the international gravity of the situation and, the world's desperate hope for some kind of de-escalation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems abundantly clear, doesn't it? This is a truly significant moment, a big one. The whole geopolitical dynamic seems to have shifted incredibly rapidly, with the U.S. now directly involved in what many are describing as essentially a new direct conflict with Iran, getting its hands dirty, as we said.
Yeah, and I think a key takeaway here is that despite Iran's, defiant public posture, it is currently exposed militarily. That's what the analysis suggests. Its forward defenses, that ring of fire across the region, it seems to have been largely wiped out or severely degraded. So the calculations for its response are incredibly complex now. And what's profoundly uncertain is the future stability of the entire region. We shouldn't overestimate Iran's conventional military strength, that seems clear. But their asymmetric capabilities, even if limited, they're still a potent and, frankly, unpredictable factor.
So, what does all this mean for you as you're watching these developments unfold? Given this historical context we've discussed and the sheer volatility of the current situation, what might be the long-term impact of this major turn of the page, as some are calling it, on the internal politics of the nations involved, Iran, Israel, the US, and on the broader global border? Could this really mark a new era of unpredictable engagements? Or maybe are there hidden pathways to de-escalation, pathways we haven't even considered yet?